Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to unpack the core ideas from important sources, giving you the context and the real substance behind them.
And today we're delving into a really fascinating period, late 18th century London. We're looking at an anonymous writer, someone known only as Junius, who absolutely terrified the government and, well, stirred up the public like few others.
That's right. We're talking about the years 1769 to 1772. George III's on the throne. Things are tense politically. And suddenly these letters start appearing in the London Public Advertiser. And they aren't just commentary.
No, not at all. They were incredibly sharp, deeply argued, and just fearless. They went right after the biggest names in government, the Prime Minister, the Duke of Grafton, even critiques aimed implicitly, at least, at the king himself. It was, well, pretty unprecedented in its boldness.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really get into Junius's core thinking. What was he actually arguing? It turns out to be this incredibly powerful defense of constitutional liberty. That's the heart of it.
And it's a defense that's rooted in a very specific idea. Not that rulers are good or kind. Junius definitely didn't buy that. But that liberty depends on the citizens themselves, on their vigilance, their courage, their willingness to stand up.
It's amazing how one person hiding behind a pseudonym could cause such a stir. We're going to focus on sort of three key pillars of his argument today. First, this idea about the absolute necessity of a free press, like a really free, aggressive press. Second, his warning about what he called minute encroachments, tiny attacks on the Constitution that add up.
Right. The slow erosion.
Exactly. And third, the role of the ordinary citizen, especially through the jury system, as a vital check on power.
And it's crucial to understand right from the start that Junius wasn't really pushing for rebellion. His whole point, as we'll see, was about preservation. He saw the nation kind of sleepwalking into losing his freedoms and wanted to wake everyone up.
Okay, let's unpack that idea of preservation. Because when Junius eventually gathered these letters into a book, he wrote this dedication to the English people. And it wasn't just, thanks for reading, it was a warning.
A very serious warning. And he starts by building his own credibility in a way. He makes this famous statement in the dedication, "I am the sole depositary of my own secret, and it shall perish with me."
Which is quite a statement. Why was that so important?
Well, it basically preempted any accusations that he was doing this for personal gain or because he was part of some political faction trying to get power. By staying anonymous permanently, he was saying, look, this isn't about me, it's about the message. His identity dies with him.
So the message had to stand entirely on his own merits. And that message, the core of it in that dedication, it reads almost like a political manifesto, doesn't it? It's a demand for constant vigilance.
Absolutely. This is probably the most famous line, the one that really sums up his philosophy. He tells the public to never to suffer an invasion of your political constitution, however minute the instance may appear, to pass by without a determined, persevering resistance.
However minute the instance. That's the key part, isn't it? It's not about waiting for some huge act of tyranny.
Exactly. He's saying liberty doesn't usually die in a big dramatic explosion. It dies by inches. Through these tiny little concessions, these small precedents that seem unimportant at the time, that's the danger he's focused on.
And this leads straight into what you called his doctrine of precedent, the danger of just letting things slide. How did he see that working?
He lays it out very clearly. He says, one precedent creates another, they soon accumulate. And then, crucially, what yesterday was fact, today is doctrine.
Okay, break that down. Fact becomes doctrine.
Think of it like this. A government minister does something a bit shady, maybe pushes the boundaries of their power in a small way. If nobody objects, if the public just accepts the fact that it happened, then pretty soon, that fact gets treated as normal. It becomes accepted practice, a doctrine.
Right. So next time, they can point back and say, well, we did this before, and nobody complained, and they can push things even further.
Precisely. The public silence becomes a kind of permission slip, and suddenly you've got a new norm that chips away at freedom. It means, for Junius, that citizens can't just sit back and assume their rights are safe.
You have to actively defend them. He talks about liberty and property as a freehold, right? Something you own.
Yes, an unimpaired hereditary freehold. It's not a gift from the government, it's yours by right. But, he warns, it's only secure if the owners, the people, have the sense and spirit enough to defend them. It puts a huge responsibility on the citizen. The government officials are just trustees, the people are the real owners.
And he saw a major flaw in the system. something that actually made this slow surrender easier. He pointed the finger at long parliaments, didn't he? The Septennial Act.
He absolutely did. The Septennial Act of 1716 had extended the maximum time between general elections from 3 years to 7. For Junius, this was a disaster. He called it the very foundation of the undue influence of the crown.
Why was 7 years so much worse than 3, in his view? What did that extra time allow?
It boils down to accountability. With elections every 3 years, MPs had to constantly think about what their constituents wanted. They couldn't stray too far for too long, but 7 years. That gave them breathing room.
Breathing room to forget the voters and focus on pleasing the crown, maybe. Getting patronage, jobs, favors.
That's exactly how Junius saw it. It allowed MPs to become dependent on the crown's influence rather than the people's support. He said these long parliaments answer every purpose of arbitrary power to the crown.
Meaning the king could basically get his way through influencing parliament without needing to be openly autocratic.
Right. And it came with an expense and oppression to the people, which would be unnecessary in an arbitrary government. It was corrupt and expensive, and he had that really sharp analogy for it.
The one about sin and repentance.
That's the one. He said MPs under the Septennial Act had 6 years for offense and but 1 for atonement. 6 years to pursue their own interests, serve the crown, maybe enrich themselves, and then just 1 year before an election to try and look like they cared about the voters again.
Like a deathbed repentance, he called it, which seldom reaches to restitution. It's a structure almost designed, in his view, to encourage MPs to betray the public trust.
Exactly. It tilted the balance of power away from the people and towards the executive and its network of influence.
Okay, so if Parliament itself is potentially compromised by this structure, where did Junius think the people's defense lay? What was their main weapon for holding power accountable? You mentioned the press earlier.
Yes, the press was absolutely central to his thinking. He famously called the liberty of the press the palladium of all your rights.
The palladium, like the mythical statue protecting Troy. If you lose it, the city falls.
Precisely that. It's a very powerful image. For Junius, if you lose the freedom of the press, all your other liberties are basically undefended. They become vulnerable.
How did he see the press actually working as a shield? Was it just about printing facts, getting information out there?
It was more than that. It was about exerting moral pressure. He called it a censorial power. Essentially, the press holds up a mirror to those in power.
So ministers and judges have to worry about their reputation.
Exactly. Through the scrutiny of the press, Junius argued, officials are forced to choose between his duty and his reputation. Even if they could technically get away with something legally, the fear of public exposure, of being shamed, could keep them in line. It forces corruption out into the open.
But writing the kinds of things Junius wrote directly accusing powerful ministers must have been incredibly risky legally. Libel laws were harsh. How did he justify the need for such aggressive criticism?
He tackled that head on. He acknowledged that the law already protected private individuals from slander. If you defame your neighbor, they can sue you or have you indicted. That's fine.
But public figures are different.
Yes. When you're talking about men in office and the measures of government, Junius insisted that considerable latitude must be allowed. You have to be able to criticize them robustly, even harshly. If every strong criticism of a minister is treated like private slander, then the press can't function as a check on power. It becomes toothless.
And this very issue, the freedom to criticize power, brought Junius into a major showdown with the legal establishment, specifically the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Mansfield. This involved the role of the jury, didn't it?
It did. This is probably the most critical legal fight in the letters. It was all about the jury's right to return a general verdict in libel cases. Junius insisted this right was fundamental, part of your Constitution.
Okay, what exactly is a general verdict, and why was Mansfield trying to get rid of it, at least in libel cases?
A general verdict is simple, really. The jury hears the case and decides guilty or not guilty. That single verdict covers everything, both the facts of the case, like did the defendant actually publish this paper, and the legal question, was the publication actually a crime? Was it libelous or seditious?
So the jury decides the whole thing, fact and law together.
Right. But Mansfield, particularly in the trial of Woodfall, who was the printer of Junius's fiery address to the king, tried to change that. He introduced what became known as the Mansfield doctrine.
And what did that doctrine say?
Mansfield basically told the jury their job was only to determine the facts, except the fact of printing and publishing, and maybe whether names were filled in correctly in the blanks. He explicitly said that the question of whether the publication was a crime was no matter of consideration to 12 men.
Wow. So he wanted the jury just to confirm, yes, this person printed this document, and that's it.
Pretty much, like a rubber stamp for the facts. Then the really important question, was it actually criminal? Was it seditious libel? Mansfield wanted that decision to be left entirely to the judge,
Who, of course, was often appointed by the crown and potentially more sympathetic to the government's view.
Exactly. Junius saw this immediately and attacked it fiercely. He called Mansfield's instructions false, absurd, illegal, and unconstitutional. He pointed out that in literally every other type of criminal case, the jury decides both the fact and the crime in that one word. Guilty or not guilty? Why should libel be different?
It seems like a pretty blatant attempt to sideline the jury in politically sensitive cases. If the government couldn't convince a jury that something was libelous, they could just change the rules so the jury didn't get to decide that question anymore.
That was precisely the danger Junius identified. It would strip the jury of its power to act as a moral check, to represent the community's view on whether something truly was criminal. It concentrates too much power in the judge, allowing them to be both the finder of guilt and the one imposing punishment, all based just on the jury confirming the bare fact of publication.
Did Junius find any ammunition within that Woodfall trial itself to fight back against Mansfield?
He did. He pointed out a delicious irony. The king's own lawyer, the attorney general, Mr. de Grey, spent ages, like an hour, Junius says, trying to convince the jury of the criminal intent of the paper, its pernicious tendency.
Wait, he argued about the very things Mansfield said the jury shouldn't consider.
Exactly. De Grey was basically trying to persuade the jury that the paper was indeed libelous. The exact question Mansfield claimed was reserved for the judge. Junius jumped all over this, arguing that the attorney general's own actions proved that, in practice, everyone knew the jury had to consider the criminality, not just the fact of printing.
So by defending the general verdict, Junius wasn't just arguing a technical legal point. He was defending the citizen's role, through the jury, as the ultimate judge of whether a political act crossed the line into criminality, protecting them from judges acting politically.
Absolutely. It was about keeping that crucial check and balance in place, ensuring the law served justice, not just the state.
Okay, so beyond these big constitutional principles, the press, the jury, the danger of President Junius was also deeply involved in calling out specific acts of corruption happening right then and there.
Oh, yes. Most of the letters are actually detailed attacks on specific ministers and their actions, but he always framed it, or tried to frame it, as a moral issue, not just a political disagreement. He kept coming back to this idea. People in power are trustees. They hold their office in trust for the nation. They aren't the masters.
And if they betray that trust,
then they have failed their moral duty, and it's the duty of citizens and the press to expose them. His very first letter sets this tone. He basically links the country's problems directly to the flawed character of the leading ministers.
Who was his main target right at the beginning?
The Prime Minister, the Duke of Grafton. Junius pulls no punches. He describes Grafton as getting into office by accident and then becoming an apostate by design, abandoning his principles. He paints him as inconsistent, capricious, and more interested in handing out public money to buy influence than in managing it responsibly.
So incompetent and possibly corrupt.
That's the clear implication. Just not fit for the job, driven by whim and patronage. And then there was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord North.
What was the issue with North? Mainly financial mismanagement.
Yes. Junius basically said North hadn't shown any competence since taking office. No plan has been formed, no system adhered to, for the relief of public credit. The national debt was huge, a major concern, and Junius accused North of having no real strategy to deal with it.
He mentioned something specific about how North was handling the king's debts using lotteries.
Right. The king had run up large debts on the civil list, basically, his household and government operating expenses. North proposed funding these debts through public lotteries. Junius found this appalling.
Why? Because lotteries were seen as immoral.
Partly that, but also because he felt it demeaned the crown. He said using lotteries ill becomes the royal dignity. He compared it to fundraising for the repairs of a country bridge or a decayed hospital. It made the monarchy look desperate and associate it with, well, gambling and vice. It was fiscally questionable and damaging to the crown's image.
And this wasn't just about domestic issues. Junius connected the ministry's failures to the growing crisis in America, too.
Definitely. He saw the government's policies as actively pushing the colonies towards conflict into excesses little short of rebellion, as he put it. He particularly criticized the Earl of Hillsborough's handling of the colonial assemblies.
What was Hillsborough doing wrong, according to Junius?
It was about the way he was governing. Junius pointed to Hillsborough demanding that colonial assemblies retract resolutions they had passed, resolutions the Crown didn't like. If they refused, Hillsborough threatened to dissolve them.
So using coercion rather than negotiation.
Exactly. Junius called this demand an arbitrary condition, an unwarrantable stretch of prerogative. He felt the ministry was using heavy-handed arbitrary power instead of trying to find political solutions, which was just inflaming the situation and making reconciliation impossible.
These are serious criticisms of policy incompetence. But Junius went even further, didn't he? He made direct accusations of actual bribery and selling offices.
Yes, this was probably the most explosive stuff. In letters 33 and 34, he directly accused the Duke of Grafton, the Prime Minister, of selling a government position, a patent place in the customs office at Exeter, to a man named Mr. Hine.
For how much?
The figure Junius quotes is about £3,500, a very significant sum back then.
And where did Junius claim that money went?
This is where it gets really scandalous. Junius alleged the money was paid to a Colonel Burgoyne. Burgoyne had recently been fined £1,000 by the courts for misconduct during an election in Preston.
So, the accusation was that Grafton sold a public job to get money to either reward Burgoyne for his political activities, or maybe even to reimburse him for his fine, using public office as a slush fund, essentially.
That was the clear implication. Selling public appointments for cash to settle political debts or reward allies. It's about as direct a charge of corruption as you can make against a prime minister.
And Junius used a clever legal trick to hammer this point home, didn't he? Involving Lord Mansfield again.
He did, brilliantly. There had been a recent case where Lord Mansfield had strongly condemned a man named Mr. Vaughan just for offering a bribe to buy a future government position, a reversion.
Okay, so Mansfield condemned even the offer of a bribe.
Right. So Junius turns to Mansfield in his letter and basically says, okay, you condemned Vaughan for just offering money. What do you say now when the Prime Minister himself isn't just waiting to be bribed, but is actively soliciting the bribe, impatiently soliciting the touch of corruption?
He's using Mansfield's own legal standard against Grafton. If offering a bribe is bad, surely soliciting and taking one is far worse, especially for the Prime Minister.
Exactly. He put Mansfield in a terrible position, and the reaction was telling.
What happened?
The prosecution against Vaughan, the guy who offered the bribe, was suddenly dropped. Junius immediately claimed this was proof the ministry was terrified. They didn't want the Vaughan case going forward because it would inevitably draw more attention to Grafton's own, much more serious alleged corruption in the Hine affair.
So the cover-up, in Junius's eyes, confirmed the crime. He said it fixed shameless prostitution upon the face of the House of Commons. Strong words.
Extremely strong. He was arguing that this wasn't just one bad apple. It showed corruption was systemic, reaching right to the top of government.
Given this level of alleged corruption, it's maybe not surprising that Junius also focused on how the justice system itself could be twisted for political ends. The case of the McCormack pardon seems like a prime example.
Oh, absolutely. The McCormack case caused a huge public outcry, and Junius dissected it mercilessly. The basic facts are, a man named James McCormack was involved in a violent riot during the Brentford election, a very politically charged event, and someone, a Mr. Clark, was killed. McCormack was tried for murder and found guilty by a jury.
A clear verdict. So what happened?
The Duke of Grafton, the Prime Minister Junius was already attacking, advised King George III to grant McCormack a royal pardon. The conviction was just wiped away.
On what grounds? How could the government justify overturning a jury's guilty verdict in a murder trial?
This is where it gets constitutionally murky. Grafton didn't really use legal arguments. Instead, he relied on a report from the Surgeons Company, basically, a panel of medical experts.
Experts convened after the trial.
Yes, a kind of post-mortem review. These surgeons examined the medical evidence about the victim's wound and concluded, based on their opinion, that the blow McCormack struck couldn't have been the fatal one. This medical opinion was then used as the basis for recommending the pardon.
So a non-legal body, chosen by the government, effectively overruled a jury's decision based on medical opinion delivered after the fact. That sounds exactly like the kind of minute encroachment Junius warned about.
It's a perfect example. It sets a precedent that a jury's verdict, reached through a formal legal process, can be undone by the executive branch based on the opinion of government-selected experts. It potentially turns the royal pardon power, meant for mercy, into a tool for political interference in the justice system.
Did Junius challenge the medical findings or the process?
He challenged the process, absolutely. He pointed out a suspicious detail. During the actual trial, McCormack's lawyers apparently didn't call two potentially key witnesses, surgeons named Bromfield and Starling.
Why not?
Well, Junius implies that if their evidence had actually helped McCormack, his lawyers would surely have put them on the stand under oath. The fact they didn't, and that the government later relied on this separate post-trial surgeons company report, suggested to Junius that the report was just a convenient way to manufacture an excuse for a politically motivated pardon.
And he contrasted this pardon with other cases, didn't he? To highlight the perceived hypocrisy.
He did. He bitterly accused Grafton of showing mercy only to politically convenient figures like McCormack, involved in a pro-government riot, or murderers only, while ignoring pleas for pardons for popular figures like John Wilkes, who was in trouble for political offenses against the government.
So justice wasn't blind. It depended on whose side you were on. Grafton's use of the pardon power, Junius argued, turned even the mercy of the prerogative into cruelty and oppression to the subject.
Because it showed justice was arbitrary and political, not principled.
The other major case Junius used to hammer home this theme of constitutional erosion was the whole saga surrounding John Wilkes and the Middlesex election. This one seems to strike right at the heart of representative government.
It absolutely does. This became a huge constitutional flashpoint. John Wilkes, as you mentioned, was a very popular but also very controversial politician. He kept getting elected by the voters, the freeholders of Middlesex, but the House of Commons really didn't like him. They expelled him.
Okay, but the voters kept re-electing him anyway.
Overwhelmingly, several times. So the House of Commons took a drastic step. They passed a resolution stating that Wilkes, having been expelled, was and is incapable of being elected.
They declared him ineligible even though the voters chose him.
Yes. And then the really outrageous part, in many people's eyes, they declared that Colonel Luttrell, the government-favored candidate who had received far, far fewer votes than Wilkes, was the actual duly elected MP for Middlesex.
They just ignored the election results and installed their preferred candidate.
Essentially, yes. They voided the majority's votes. Junius saw this as an incredibly dangerous power grab by the legislature. His core argument was, if simply being expelled from the House makes you incapable of being re-elected, then what's to stop the majority in Parliament from just expelling anyone they don't like?
Any opposition member who becomes too effective or troublesome?
Exactly. He warned that the majority could, at any time, remove the honestest and ablest men who happen to be in opposition to them. It basically gives the sitting majority the power to choose its own members, regardless of what the voters want. It makes elections potentially meaningless.
So how did the government lawyers try to justify this? Did they claim there was some precedent for it?
They did try. They pointed back to an old case involving Robert Walpole from the late 1690s, but Junius, who clearly did his homework, dismantled their argument brilliantly.
How did the Walpole case actually differ?
Junius showed that Walpole had been expelled, then re-elected, and was actually allowed back into his seat in the same parliament. It was only later, when Walpole was expelled again for specific crimes, high breach of trust, and notorious corruption, that he was declared incapable.
So the incapacity in Walpole's case was linked to proven criminal conduct, not just the act of expulsion itself.
Precisely. But Junius pointed out that in the resolution declaring Wilkes incapable, the House of Commons had deliberately omitted any reference to specific crimes. They simply said he was incapable because he had been expelled.
That selective editing of the precedent seems crucial.
It was the whole point for Junius. He accused the ministry of twisting history to create a new, arbitrary power for the House, the power to disqualify opponents simply because the majority disliked them. He predicted the people of Middlesex would keep re-electing Wilkes anyway in order to try again the great question of right, showing that ultimately the people's spirit, their insistence on their rights, was the final check.
So looking back at all these arguments, the press, the jury, the precedents, the specific corruption cases, what Junius was really doing was weaving them all together into this larger moral challenge, wasn't he?
Absolutely. It wasn't just disconnected critiques. It was a sustained argument that the entire political system was at risk because those in power had forgotten they were trustees and were acting like masters, and that the only real defense was the constant vigilance and moral courage of the people themselves.
And this comes through really strongly in his final letter, number 35, which was addressed directly to King George III. That must have taken some nerve.
Incredible nerve. And in it, he distills his core message. Liberty isn't ultimately guaranteed by laws on paper, because laws can be twisted, as he showed, but by speech, conscience, and courage. It depends, he argues, fundamentally on the spirit of the people.
The spirit to question, to resist, to hold power accountable. And Junius himself, writing anonymously, risking prosecution for his printer, Woodfall, kind of embodied that courage he was calling for.
He really did. He became this voice that, as you said earlier, was too dangerous to silence and too honest to ignore. Even hidden, the power of the argument, the sheer force of the language was undeniable.
Reading Junius today, it feels like a potent reminder that freedom isn't a passive state. It's something that requires active defense, a moral commitment.
Exactly. A reminder that if citizens become complacent, if they stop questioning, stop resisting those minute encroachments, then no constitution, however well written, can truly protect them in the long run.
Which brings us back to that final, very pointed question he put to the king in that last letter. It really lays bare the ultimate source of political legitimacy.
It does. He essentially asks the king, what if your people decide to follow the glorious example of their ancestors? What if they appeal to God, the high being who gave them the rights of humanity, rights which he says it would be sacrilege to surrender?
He's invoking a higher authority than the king himself.
Yes. And then he asks the king, if it comes to that, if the people feel forced to defend those God-given rights against their own government, on what part of his subjects could he rely for assistance?
Wow. That's basically asking the king, if you push too hard, who will actually stand with you against the will of the people defending their fundamental rights? It implies the king's power ultimately depends on the consent of the governed.
It's the ultimate challenge. If the ruler loses the moral trust of the people through corruption and arbitrary actions, then their authority rests on nothing solid. The ultimate power resides with the people willing to defend their liberties.
And Junius, that anonymous pen, showed that one of the highest forms of defending those liberties is precisely that act of holding government accountable, whether you're a writer, a jury member, a voter, or just an engaged citizen.
That's his enduring legacy, the call for vigilance, for courage, for recognizing that the defense of liberty starts with each individual's willingness to resist those small steps toward tyranny.
And the question he leaves echoing down the centuries, really, is whether we today are still tuned in to those potential minute encroachments. Do we still have that collective spirit he called for to push back before fact quietly hardens into doctrine?
A question that never really loses its relevance. It's been fascinating to dive into Junius's world and his powerful arguments. Thanks for exploring this with me.
My pleasure. Truly vital voice from the past with lessons that still resonate.
Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to The Deep Dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shape liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.